Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mizoro, and today we're actually going to start talking about the evolution of life and, for that matter, the evolution of plants on Earth, because plants were really some of the first forms of complex life that evolved on Earth. And in order to describe how plants first got here, I really have to spend a little bit of time giving you an idea of what Earth was like before there was any life, or really any life was possible. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Earth before anything existed on it, before dinosaurs, way before any of that. Literally 450 million years before even the first animals. Then we're going to start talking about what the first life to evolve on Earth was and what conditions that life had to cope with when it got here. And then what parts of plants can that first life actually be seen? Because there are parts of plant cells that actually are those first original organisms that came onto Earth, or have traces of those first original organisms. And last, we're going to talk about how the first true land plants evolved. And in this chapter, I'm basically going to follow this timeline, and I'm going to do it in give or take 100 million year spurts. So if you're paying attention, just to get an idea of how long ago we're talking, this is Pangaea right here, 200 million years ago. So we're going about 2.5 times farther back than that, 500 to 400 million years ago, 2 or 3 or 4 Pangaeas ago. And if we zoom in on that 100 million years, between 5 and 400 million years, two things really happen. One, CO2 in the air starts going down. And then as CO2 goes down, oxygen goes up. And the reason is because about 410 million years ago, the first land plants evolve. They lack roots, vascular tissue. They lack really everything except the ability to photosynthesize. So that's what we're going to get to today. So let's start. So, what was the Earth like before there was life? You're looking at it. This is a picture of a salt flat, and a couple of pictures of salt flats, and this is what the Earth looked like. It was barren, it was hot, there was lots of poisonous gas, there was no soil because there was no moss to make the soil, there's no fresh water, everything is very, very hot, like I said, it was just hot rock and salty water. Hot rock, I don't mean like, hot rock, like, ooh, this rock is hot. I mean like rock that's hotter than boiling water. Rock that if it rained on it, the rain would boil off before it could even pool. The air above that soil was even worse. It was loaded with poison gas. There really wasn't very much oxygen. There was methane and sulfur like you see here. All of these clouds of poison gas leach into the atmosphere. And even if there was oxygen, it wouldn't matter because there was no ozone. So any life that formed basically got blasted by UV radiation until it died. It was basically sterile and barren. So we have ultra hot conditions, ultra salty conditions, poison gas in the atmosphere, ultra salty, acidic, barren, ultra salty lake water, whatever, river water, ocean water. How does life even form? Or what kind of life can even survive this? The answer is we can actually look to current day Earth to know what can survive this. This is Lake Magadi, and it's in Kenya, in the Kenyan Rift Valley. And if you notice, Lake Magadi is purple. And it's purple because of a very specific type of bacteria. Now, something you have to understand about Lake Magadi, it's extremely salty, about 4 or 5 times saltier than the water in the oceans. And more to the point, Lake Magadi is a very narrow lake, so that water is actually superheated by the sun. It becomes very, very hot, and yet it's still purple. And that's because at the dawn of all life, there was really one type of organism that could survive. It was bacteria. Bacteria start forming and pooling in these pools of water. Why in water? Well, because if they're anywhere above water, they get blasted by that UV radiation and they're in that poison gas. But you don't have to be too far below water before you're shielded from that UV radiation. And you don't even have to go to Kenya to see it. This is the Grand Prismatic Stream in Yellowstone National Park. And if you look at both these pictures, neither one of them are photo altered. That's what they look like. In this superheated boiling water, you see these great kind of rainbow of colors, and those colors are produced by bacteria and bacteria-like organisms that start forming in these little puddles of superheated, ultra-briny water shielded by UV light. And they're fine. They're not very complex, so they can withstand the super salty conditions, super hot conditions. So that was the very first types of life that exist. Now, we're a botany class, so why do we care about bacteria in the ocean about 450 million years ago? Well, that bacteria started doing something really weird. If you notice, they're all colored. And they're all colored because they have pigments. They all have pigments because they needed to make their own food. These was, in fact, we wouldn't call them bacteria today. Really what they are is they're chloroplasts. What they are is tiny little free-floating chloroplasts. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking chloroplasts aren't alive, but chloroplasts actually have more in common with bacteria than they do with nucleated cells, like we're used to seeing them in plant cells. They have a little bit of DNA, a little bit of cytoplasm, and the ability to make their own food, which is necessary for them to live with light, which, of course, there is plenty of. So these tiny little bacteria, primal chloroplasts floating around in that superheated water, they start to photosynthesize. And as they start to photosynthesize, they start to group together in bigger and bigger numbers, and eventually some cells start eating those chloroplasts and not killing them, but just containing them. And if you get a big cell that contains a bunch of little chloroplasts that are all photosynthesizing inside of it, well, that's sort of like a plant cell. So it wasn't long into this 500 million year ago cycle that these guys come along. The very, very first land plants. They're not around anymore. And in fact, we had no idea what they were until we were walking down an old stone wall in Scotland, and a rock that had fallen off showed these really weird fossils. It wasn't until a paleobotanist first looked at these fossils, and he, knowing what he was looking like, said, that doesn't look like a rock formation, that looks like life. And so he took that rock home and he cut it and polished it, and he noticed this stuff inside of it. And he realized, oh my God, this rock, which we date at about 490 million years old, this rock contains fossils of the very, very first land plants ever to exist. They were multicellular, eukaryotic, sexually reproducing organisms that alternated generations, and they lacked vascular tissue, and they clearly didn't have any seeds. They just made spores. In other words, they were plants, and specifically they were mosses, bryophytes. This is kind of a computer image of what we think they look like based on the fossils that we found, and we found others since then. We named this plant Aglophyton, but you don't need to know that. And again, that was in Scotland. Scotland is, in a lot of cases, where advanced life first started. And to get an idea about what we mean by advanced life, we're not talking about humans, and we're not even talking about animals. We're not even talking about jellyfish and sponges. We're not even talking about things like mushrooms. We're talking about things before all of that, even more primitive. We're talking about the very first time organisms said, okay, maybe we can survive above the soil. Because as that bacteria, that chloroplast bacteria, started producing more and more oxygen created more and more ozone. More and more ozone shielded the air from UV radiation, and all of a sudden it became possible to exist just at the border of water. Now, that border of water is exactly that. These first land plants, they didn't have any vascular tissue. When we look at them, we don't see any cell differentiation in these old fossils. They just look like a group of cells. No roots, no leaves, just stems with simple kind of sexual tips on the top of them that release spores. And because they didn't have any vascular tissue, any way of moving water in and out of their body, they had to stay right next to the water's edge. But this was the start. This was the first time life climbed out of the ocean, and ever since then it stayed there. But it's still relatively close to the water. It's going to be hundreds of millions of years before life, plants specifically, find out ways of getting farther and farther away from the water's edge where it's crowded with life into more and more expansive areas where they can absorb light. And even more hundreds of million years in the future before they figure out how to make sexually reproducing, nucleated, non-photosynthetic organisms. In other words, animals. But for right now, in Scotland, 410 million years ago, this is the only type of life that exists outside of the water. So that's it. We start with this completely barren, poisonous, inhospitable landscape, a landscape that really resembles Venus or Mars more than it resembles Earth today as we know it. And we learned that in that briny pool of acid, poison, super salty water came bacteria. Very simple life that can that with the water shielded from light, UV radiation, and can start taking CO2 out of that water and out of that atmosphere, converting it into oxygen. And it did this. It did this for, give or take, 5 or 6 times as long as human beings have even been on this actually 50 or 60 times longer than human beings have been on this earth. And after 50 or 60 times the time that human beings have been on this earth, finally there's enough oxygen in the atmosphere to actually develop an ozone to shield the outside of water from UV radiation. And you get aglyphyton, bryophytes, the first organisms to actually come out of the water. And they have with them these original bacteria-like organisms that were photosynthesizing all along. Only now they're chloroplasts inside larger cells. And those first true plants, bryophytes, started the entire plant. All land earth, all land life can in some way be traced back to that first stage out of the water. So now that we have bryophytes on Earth, we're going to actually go on and we're going to start talking about how bryophytes started changing the planet and then how ferns actually got here. So that's that.